Good day, and welcome to the 32nd episode of the English Sovereigns podcast series. In today's, I shall be discussing King Edward V's, or, as history knows him, King Edward III. One of our more famous kings, Edward was monarch between 1327 and 1377 for 50 years. He was 14 when he became the king, and when he was born 14 years earlier, his birth had placated the barons. If you remember, during the reign of Edward II, they were quite annoyed at Edward's constant meddling in Scotland, or at least his failed military campaigns there. So the birth of Edward, temporarily at least, granted Edward II some prestige. Then Edward II gave Edward III, or Prince of Wales then as he was known, lots of land and titles, which meant he had his own power base and sort of became independent a bit from Edward II, which was pretty useful when his accession came along, because nobody had a problem with Edward III when he was made king, when his father abdicated in 1327. However, for the first 3 years of his reign, it was actually Mortimer, namely his mother, Edward's mother, Queen Isabella's lover, who was in charge of the country and was king in all but name. He kept a very close watch on Edward and tried to control what he did, and he was also quite a corrupt man. But in 1330, Edward was summoned to Nottingham Castle, perhaps because they'd gotten wind of Edward's plans to depose the sort of regime who was ruling in his name. But Edward actually got wind of what was going to happen. He was going to be put before a great council, and maybe tried or sanctioned in some way. He actually managed to sneak through one of the underground tunnels in Nottingham Castle, arrived unannounced, well, not unannounced, at least they arrived surprising Mortimer, and had Mortimer arrested and thrown in prison. And I think he was executed, or at least, he wasn't seen again in royal circles. So from this moment on, Edward is pretty much in charge of the country. He was a great start as king. So, as king, he sort of epitomised the gentlemanly, chivalrous nature, very much embodied the age. I think if you think of medieval monarchs, you go to Edward III first. So that's quite a big thing that he is famous for, I think. He was, or indeed I think he considered himself, primus inter pares, which means first among equals, with his nobility. So he sort of fostered the aristocratic culture, and this is most well embodied by the famous Order of the Garter, which whose residence is in Windsor and only has, I think, 25 members each time, and is I think it's the personal behest of the monarch that's awarded. It's awarded for contributing a lot to your country, or at least back then it was a very chivalrous organisation, and still is to an extent now. So that was quite good. But then also, on the flip side, you got into the order largely because you killed loads of people in a battle, or if you were really good at sport, hunting stags, or doing anything that involved killing. So there are two sides to every story, I suppose. So in terms of his foreign policy, he was able to reverse the humiliation of Bannockburn and restore the honour of England with his longbows. Actually, his longbows were quite very useful to him, and this was done at Halden Hill. Yes, as I said, very prestigious. He also took the town of Berwick, which I think has remained under English control ever since, and therefore secured the north of England against invasion from Scotland. And in this campaign, he was shown to be a natural war leader around which everyone could coalesce within the country, and this would manifest itself when he went to war with France and began the 100 Years' War. So, in 1340, he claimed the French throne, saying he was the only male line descendant of the French king Philip IV. And this began the 100 Years' War because the King of France at the time disagreed, obviously. To sustain an army, he, of course, needed money, and this is where the parliamentary role became enhanced as a sort of giver of money and controller of taxes, and their role was very much embedded during the reign of Edward, especially for a 100 Years' War. The king always had to make sure he consulted Parliament in this regard. But this was almost of benefit to Edward. It's not like Edward was reluctantly going, I need to consult Parliament. Obviously, perhaps he'd much rather have had an inexhaustible supply of money, but he didn't. Point is, the fact that he was able to get parliamentary approval, when it was made up of small landowners in the Commons and larger landowners in the Lords, meant that they had a stake in it, and therefore the people of England had a stake of it. So it kind of fostered a sense of representativeness, and this was further enhanced by the treaties and reports of the war, which he would regularly give Parliament, or some of his ministers would regularly give Parliament. This again would help create a sense of what was going on in the war and made Parliament have a stake in it, and then people could therefore coalesce around Edward as the sort of epoch of English national identity and purpose. So in 1346, he won at the Battle of Crécy, which is near Calais. English troops were outnumbered 8-1 against the French, but Englishmen having longbowmen and the first modern use of cannon in European theatres was of great use. And though the Black Death, I think, hit within the 1350s, his son Edward, Prince of Wales, who would actually predecease him, won at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, again using the same tactics, and this resulted in the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, which I think Edward didn't really push enough on, so he renounced his claim to the French throne, which is obviously the casus belli of the war, but he was able to make consolidations of his gains. Perhaps it might have been better to have insisted on the throne of France, in the way kind of Henry V was able to say he wanted to be heir to the throne when the King of France at the time died. Maybe that might have been better, but English kings would be played. They would never be kings of France in anything but name, I think, throughout this time. So maybe Edward had the best opportunity here, apart from maybe Henry V. So the only other thing perhaps in foreign policy I should mention is that the French controlled the papal curia from, I think, 1306 to 1376. So they were in control for a lot of the time. So Edward legislated to make sure that the effect of this wasn't too great, because if the French controlled the papal curia and England was paying tithes towards the Pope, that meant that the French were essentially using English money to fight against the English, which obviously made no sense. So he made sure to legislate against that and tried to assert the supremacy of, especially when the Pope was a puppet on for the French. So, in terms of domestic policy, which is sort of leading on from what I was just talking about, he passed quite two interesting bits of legislation, both in 1351. Firstly, the Statute of Labourers, to fix the wages at pre-plague levels, which sounds very much furloughy, to be honest, like in this present pandemic. But the lords had the right to claim basically their feudal underlings or the rights of their servicemen, which kind of created a lot of discontent among the peasantry, which basically, because they couldn't go where supply and demand dictated to, it seemed as if the king was trying to legislate against supply and demand, which I'm not sure you can really do too well. This is one of the underlying causes of the 1381 peasants' revolt under his grandson and successor, King Richard II. The second act was the Treason Act, which actually defined treason. So under common law, judges have been judging on what was treason, what wasn't treason, and often it was down to the caprice of the king. But in this act, it kind of streamlined what treason meant. And it's actually one of the acts still enforced today, although it's been very heavily amended. I don't know if you can still be killed, or executed rather, if you do, say, assassinate a member of the royal family. I don't think you can because the death penalty is illegal. But yeah, the act is still technically in place. He introduced justices of the peace, or at least embedded them further, which meant that, again, during peacetime they could enforce the law and be granted greater teeth to be able to delve into criminal cases. He also made sure his sons were well endowed and respected them a lot, because obviously his predecessors had been plagued by sons who were disloyal or would stab in the back. I'm thinking of Henry II here. So that was kind of good, although it granted them huge power bases. I think he had four sons, including John of Gaunt, Lionel, Duke of Clarence, the Duke of York, I can't remember his name. But yeah, there were lots of powerful rivals, which obviously would eventually create the War of the Roses. So I think if we're going to assess Edward, he was quite a dynamic king. There's some criticism that he was a bit of a tyrant. He wasn't really a statesman. He was just interested in doing what, say, Richard I did, which was use England as a base for his own resources and nothing else. But given Parliament's role, as I kind of mentioned, Parliament sanctioned, I think, everything he did, which largely suggests that there was some kind of concord between between Edward and the people of England, because they were in favour of what Edward was doing. So that either makes them tyrants or stupid. So I don't know. I don't think he was as bad. He probably wasn't as good an administrator, perhaps. But he did pass those acts, as I mentioned. Not a bad king at all. I think he was probably quite a good king, Edward. Not the great. Perhaps if he had been made king of France, we would have called King Edward the Great. But he probably just stopped short. I would say if we're going to put him in a tier, which I might try and make a thing now, I would say he's probably in the top quarter, but at the bottom of the top quarter. And that is that. Join me next time for episode 33, which will be King Richard II.